welcome back to my podcast. So, if you clicked on me, it's because you're thinking about getting a lizard, and good for you. You thought about doing a little bit of research first. Well, full disclaimer, it shouldn't just stop at me. I'm not an expert, I'm not a vet, I'm just somebody that worked at a pet store for about 10 years, and I know some of the most frequently asked questions and things that you probably wouldn't suspect that you're going to have to deal with when you're getting a lizard. So what I'm going to do in this episode is talk about the two most common beginner lizards, and that is the leopard gecko and the bearded dragon. So they do have some differences between the two of them. So I'm going to make sure to explain how they're very much a different animal, and they're going to have different requirements. Some of them are a little sneaky. So don't have this be your last stop. Definitely continue to research. I'm probably going to miss a lot. This is just some of the things that I know come up in everyday conversations. This is not the full gamut of information that you need before you get a reptile. But I'd like to start it off with the same way every time and say that you want to do your research and also get the habitat before you get the lizard. Now, it seems almost universal that people like to go into a pet store and try to get everything all at once, the animal as well as the setup, and I just think that that's the wrong way to go for multiple reasons. With aquatics, honestly, if you really want to do it right, you shouldn't get the fish until about 2 weeks into having the aquarium set up. I know it seems like a lot, but there's that devious thing called the nitrogen cycle that is often referred to as new tank syndrome because you don't realize what's going on in the water because you can't see it. Same thing with the reptiles. You don't need to do as much setup time for them, but they definitely do need to have, at least these two, a very specific high temperature and also humidity. And you don't want to be getting your habitat set up to that temperature while they're sitting in a cardboard box. Most pet stores will give you the animal in a cardboard box, so they're sitting in the dark, in the cold as they would see it. Even if it's room temperature, it's still cold to them. And I know this seems way out of left field, but just real quick, because this has happened, is in order to keep the lizard warm, do not put them on the dash of the car as you drive home, even if it's the dead of winter, with the heat blasting, because that will cook them. And I actually have seen that happen, so maybe tuck them in your jacket, body heat. However you want to do it, but that is not the way to go. It was tragic. It was a hard lesson learned for all, but and it seems like common sense to some of you, but it's something that since it happened, I want to pass that along to you. But getting back to it, so you're going to need to get that habitat to a certain temperature. Now, what if the bulb is the wrong wattage? Let's say. So now the habitat is either going to be too hot or too cold until you can go back, get the correct wattage, and then try again. I know some people that they're these crazy wizard people that have all of the spreadsheets in their head where it's like, what size habitat? Okay, well then you need a 75-watt bulb with it's insane that they know this stuff off the top of their head. In my case, even having worked in a pet store for 10 years, I would have to do trial and error. So that's most likely what's going to happen with you. So you don't want to have a habitat either warming up to temperature while they're sitting in a box, or come to find out warming up to the wrong temperature, either too hot or too cold. So I recommend doing the habitat first. So let's just jump into the habitat. So you can do a terrarium or an aquarium, and both have their positives and negatives. A terrarium is obviously originally intended to be a terrarium, and it'll usually have the screen top already, and it'll oftentimes have a locking mechanism on it, and that's fine. You can also get an aquarium and get a screen top for it, and it'll be roughly about the same idea. Especially when you get into the bigger habitats, I feel like sometimes the aquarium has a bit of an edge, because what you can do is, say if it's a 40 breeder, the screen top that comes on a 40 breeder, if it's a sliding one and you have heat lamps on top and the cords are too short, well, if you pull the top open, the heat lamp might reach the end of its cord and then topple into the habitat. Whereas if you have the screen top that typically fits on a 40 breeder, then it's a hinge in the middle. So you can actually have the heat lamps lined up on the back and then just open up the front as needed. And I feel like that's a little bit better because then you can do cord maintenance. I don't know if you've ever been on Reddit and you've seen the cable porn, but if you have a setup that has like multiple wires, like in the back of a PC, for instance, and they're all just nicely bundled together, and not messy. It looks and is just it's so much more effective. No snags and all that stuff. So some things to consider. I mean, I'm what, like 5 minutes in, and I'm still just barely talking about chords and habitats. But that's what I'm talking about when I'm saying just how much you really might want to consider before just on a whim getting a reptile. They need a special set of conditions that is hard to simulate in an artificial environment. So again, so the size of the habitat is going to be dependent upon the animal. So in the case of a leopard gecko, they typically only get to be 6 to 9 inches on average. So you can usually get away with a 10-gallon when they're young, and then a 20-gallon when they're an adult. And obviously, if you want to get multiple leopard geckos, then you can have to adjust that size accordingly. Now, I say multiple because leopard geckos can oftentimes, it's never a universal rule, so don't blame me if one's picking on another one, but leopard geckos can oftentimes be housed together. Whereas if you go for a bearded dragon, which often, gets far, far larger and needs a bigger habitat anyway, well, when they're young, you'll find them in the pet store, with more than one in a tank. Well, when they're young, they're not as territorial, and so you can do that. But once they become an adult, they are definitely a solo lizard. They're not sociable. They feel like there's only enough, if they were out in the wild, they'd be like, well, there's only so many bugs per desert, and there's only so many females per area. So they definitely don't like any other, lizards around. So they definitely need to be by themselves once they get older. And typically, at minimum, when they're an adult, you want a 40 breeder, preferably bigger. But something to consider that you're going to need a lot of tank space for a bearded dragon. Now, some may argue that they're worth the extra space because of the personality. I'll get into that in a minute. Right now, we're talking about habitats. So you need to get the tank, you need to get a cover, and now you need to set something on the bottom of it. Well, you can go either substrate, sand, or you can go just a carpet liner. And so, in my opinion, I prefer the carpet liner. So with the positive that the sand has is that it's more natural to their environment, and it's often calcium carbonate. So if they do get a mouthful when they eat up a cricket, they're just going to get extra calcium, in their diet. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. Now, in my opinion, cleanup makes it much more of a mess, and especially when they're really young, a lizard could potentially, now this is rare, but it does happen, a lizard could potentially get impacted bowels. Like basically they eat too much sand to be able to pass it through because it just turns into, solidified, kind of mud, I guess. And so now it's just sitting there. They can't have anything, and so it's either going to be fatal or it's going to be an expensive vet bill. Either way, you just want to avoid it. So once they're older, then that's typically a lot less of a threat. And again, even with the young ones, it's not that common of an occurrence, but it is something potential. Kind of like with rawhide with a dog. A dog probably is not going to need surgery to get the rawhide out, but every once in a great while, they do take that last bit of the knot and then they try and swallow the thing whole, and now the thing's just sitting there, not decomposing, and so it is what it is. I feel like the carpet is a much better way to go, especially when it comes to the leopard geckos. Now, the reason why I say that is that with a bearded dragon, it seems like they like to just drop their droppings wherever they so feel it. They'll drop it in their salad dish. They'll drop it in this corner. They'll drop it on their hide. And leopard geckos, more often than not, will actually just pick one corner of the habitat to go in, and they'll just continuously go in there. This is true of a lot of animals. A lot of animals will realize I only have a finite amount of space, so let's just designate this as the potty corner. And so with a mat especially, all you need to do is just keep on spot cleaning that part of the mat until the whole thing needs to be actually cleaned. And that's why I usually recommend having two mats, so that way you can have one out and soaking while the other one is in there fresh. And it's a one-time buy pretty much. I mean, until the thing gets so afraid that they're catching their poor little toes in it. That mat is going to last a long time, whereas you have to continuously rebuy the substrate. So, that's just something to consider. So now you have that. Obviously, every lizard's going to need a water dish. Oftentimes with lizards, you want to have it be big enough that they can drink out of, but also soak in. When it comes time to shed, or if they're just getting dehydrated in general, if they can soak into a dish, it'll help them get rid of that shed. It'll help them kind of hydrate a little bit more. So you want to have a decently sized, appropriately sized dish, I guess is what I want to say. So, and then you obviously want to have a hide. So A good hide will usually be something that they could climb up on top of. So you usually want to have the hide um, near the warmer side of the habitat, so that way, if they're feeling cold, they can climb up on top and be that much closer to the heat lamp. And then if they feel like they want to hide, hence the name, then they can go underneath it. And but ideally, it's going to be a hide that you can still see them in. So I see a lot of half logs, whether real or artificial. I see a little fake cave, and that's one that I don't recommend, especially with a leopard gecko, because they are usually nocturnal and like to hide. So you're not going to really see much of them unless they come out to either eat or drink. So I like the ones, at least for the leopard gecko. What it is it's like a cutout of a cave, and so it has a couple layers to it. You can put it right up against the glass, and so they can go into it and feel like they're in a hide, but you can also see them 100% clearly all the time. So I feel like that's just the best of both worlds for both of you, and at least the one that I have in mind, it's one that they can use pretty much for their whole life. They'll be able to be multiple ones on a level when they're younger, and then they'll basically just take up an entire level when they get bigger as an adult. But it is something that they can use throughout their life, so it's kind of a one-time buy, unless you accidentally break it, which might happen. But the hide is important, and also it is good to have one that has a rough surface, because that'll help them kind of get the shed off of their skin if they have something rough to rub up against. If you just have 4 glass walls, I mean, what are they going to get it off with, really? So just consider that. Um, so they get their water, their shelter. So now you got to talk about food. Well, both of them do eat mealworms. So often a ceramic dish will help keep the mealworms contained and in one space. And something that does happen with leopard geckos occasionally is that they can be blind. And so if it's a dish that's always in the same spot for a blind leopard gecko, it's so much easier for them to find, because a cricket that's just roaming around, they won't be able to hunt. So you'll either have to tongue feed the crickets, you know, yeah, you basically have to tongue feed them crickets. And so um, we'll get into the specific of food in a second, because I want to talk about lighting, because that is an interesting point with the leopard geckos especially. I have heard that certain lighting can actually make them go blind, so you really want to do your research, because they're typically live underground, and they don't actually need UVB bulb, so they don't need UV rays in order to make vitamin D to survive. Now, I've heard that you actually can still use a UVB bulb, and it'll actually allow them to make a little bit of vitamin D and make them a little bit healthier. So I'm not sure which light might potentially blind them. I'm not sure if a UVB is technically the way that you want to go with a leopard gecko. But again, do your research. This is just stuff that I've heard over the years, and it's funny how after 10 years you can still hear two different sides of a conversation. Like, for instance, the best place to feed a snake. While we're on the subject of reptiles, it's like, should you feed a snake inside the habitat or outside the habitat? There's arguments for both. So, at least with the lighting for the leopard gecko, it's debatable. Some people just use a heat basking bulb during the day, simulating sunlight without the UV rays, and then they'll have a red heat bulb for night, so that way they're still getting the warmth, but you can also see them if you want to at night without it just decimating their day-night cycle. Because just like us, they have a day-night cycle. They see it being the day for a certain amount of time, they see it being night for a certain amount of time, and it lets them know when to be awake, when to be asleep. If you mess with that, it could cause stress. So some people just use bulbs exclusively. I, however, am a huge fan of the heat mat. So with the heat mat, it's basically a one and done. You position it, you plug it in, you're good to go. And so then you can have a very low wattage light bulb for the day, and then at night you can just switch it off and just have the heat lamp be enough heat for the rest of the night. And one thing about the heat pad that I feel is that it usually will come with a picture of you putting the heat pad on the bottom of the habitat, and I don't think that's right. I think that you should actually put it on the back of the habitat, because it radiates the heat a lot better. It doesn't have to try and go through the substrate or the mat that you put down, and it just seems to be a little bit more effective. You can get a couple more degrees in there, so you might be able to go with a cheaper heat mat and get the same amount of heat that you would if you just did a bigger heat mat on the bottom. But the point is that if you do the heat mat, you want to have it on one side of the tank. This is something I didn't mention, but you want to have a warm side and a cool side. So in addition to all the lighting and the heating and all this stuff, you want to get a humidity gauge that you can just stick right in the center. You only need one of those technically, but you want to get two. And actually, it depends on the size of the habitat. Maybe you want to have two humidity gauges because maybe one side's drier than the other. Who knows? The point is that you want to have two temperature gauges because you want to have a warm side and a cool side. So the cool side is going to have the water dish. The warm side is going to have the heat lamp and the hide, so they can get really up close to the heat if they really want to. And this is important because, as you might already know, but reptiles are cold-blooded, they need to regulate the temperature based on their environment. So they're going to go into the sun to warm up if they're feeling cold, and they're going to go into the cooler area if they're feeling overwhelmed. So you can't have the entire thing be one universal temperature. You are probably going to be cooking. I mean, yeah, that's just not how they work. So you're definitely going to need to have a warmer and cooler side. Always have the water and the cooler side not directly under a heat lamp. You don't want to be boiling the water, basically. And on the subject of the UV rays, don't ever have any habitat, whether it's an aquarium, whether it's a terrarium, ever be in direct sunlight. It's going to have a greenhouse effect. There's just no real way to regulate the temperature if you're using actual sunlight. It's just not a good idea to do. So even though it seems to make sense, where well, how would I be buying a bulb in order to get UV rays when there's a sun for free? It makes sense in your head, but honestly, it's just too problematic. Don't do it. Use an actual bulb. So I've talked about UVB bulbs enough without even telling you what the heck they are. So bearded dragons, they need UV. They need rays. They're going to be sun. They exist in the sun. They're daytime creatures. So they need to make vitamin D just like the rest of us. And so they need a bulb that will actually give them UV rays for them to then convert into vitamin D. So it's a UVB bulb. It's required. If you don't do it, they're going to get lethargic, sick, and die. I hate to be blunt, but this is an adult podcast for adult people. If you're planning on getting this for your kid, you watch the video and then sugarcoat it for them later on. I feel like if, at least where I live, you have to be 18 plus to buy a pet. So I'm talking to an 18 plus audience is basically how I'm doing this. So they're going to die if you don't do a UVB bulb. And the tricky thing about a UVB bulb is that you need to switch it out on a regular basis. I believe every 3 months. Double check me on that, please, because I didn't research that. This is just off the top of my head. I think every 3 months you need to replace that bulb because even though it's still turning on and it seems fine, the whatever element it is in there that creates the UV rays, it will burn out eventually. So the light can still turn on, but it's not producing UV rays. So it is very important that you mark it on the calendar when you put it in and to change it out accordingly, whether or not it has blown itself out. So that is vitally important. And again, debatably for the bearded, for the leopard geckos as well. I'm not sure, but the bearded dragons, it's an absolute must. It's a non-negotiable one. So UVB bulb for them. Now, getting back into their food sources. So they both eat mealworms. They both eat crickets, and especially when they're young, I recommend a healthy supply of both, because they're two different types of protein and they're going to need to grow, so they need to have plenty of building blocks to grow. So you want to have a variety of diet. Now, what's great is that they can eat one or the other, so that let's say you have a shortage of crickets or a shortage of mealworms. It does happen. I believe that it's like the same person that supplies the entire country. So, I mean, it's probably a, not so easy job, and you probably have to make a bunch of them in order to have it be cost effective. And it's probably a, not so pleasant job as well. So I've just noticed that at times that I have been in the northeast part of the country and then visited the southwest part of the country, they're having a shortage at the same time. So it seems like it's the same supplier for all of them. So if they lost a colony, well, guess what? You're not going to have crickets for at least a good couple of weeks to a month. And then when they do come back, you're going to have a hard time still getting them because everybody else is going to be loading up on them because they're like, oh God, what if this happens again? Kind of like toilet paper. But anyway, I digress. Let's not get political. So the crickets and mealworms, they can do one or the other. I recommend both as often as you can. Now with the mealworms, you just put enough in the dish for them to eat, pretty consistently. You don't want to do too many because you don't want them to basically just, either get old and cocoon themselves and or die, or, get dried out from the heat lamp. You don't want to do too few because if they, finish the dish and they don't see any more, they might not check the dishes often going on. So you want to keep that relatively full. Usually if they've eaten enough by the time it's noontime, then that was enough for them for that day, but as a general rule. But with the crickets, it's... Oh, and by the way, you need a mister. You need to make the habitat a certain humidity. I touched upon that, but I forgot when I was talking about the setup. So you do need to keep it humid, and when you do spray it down, always take the mealworm dish out because you're going to drown them if you leave it in while you're misting. Sorry, I almost forgot that one. So then you want to do crickets. Crickets are a little bit more problematic because you don't want to give them way too many. And what I mean by that is they're going to start going after the crickets right away when you put them in the habitat, unless they're blind. And they love hunting them down. It's that's actually one of the most fun things to watch when it comes to a lizard is watching them hunt down crickets. They just get all interested in it, kind of like a cat stalking a dust mote. So if they eat one, they eat two, they eat three, whatever size they are, they eat a certain amount, and so then you want to make sure that you're not putting in more crickets than they can eat in a sitting. One or two extra is fine. It's not gonna, the crickets are usually gonna go off and hide. But I'm talking about like if there's, you know, 10 to 15, 5, 10, 15, that are in there roaming around crawling all over the lizard. Well, once the lizard has eaten its fill, it's a really weird thing, but they won't go after a cricket after they've satiated themselves, and so the crickets will actually start biting on the lizard and stressing them out, and and it's a weird thing. But yeah, you really only want to put in as many crickets as they're probably going to eat that day, roughly. Too many, too little. Oh well, most of them have some fat storage, so they're not going to starve until the next time you feed them. So this means that, wait, so I'm going to have to feed crickets on a regular basis and not just throw them all into the habitat. Correct. So you're either going to have to do multiple trips to the store, or you can keep them on your own. Now, keeping crickets, I almost debated just doing an entire separate episode about trying to do cricket keeping because it's not the easiest thing in the world. But just as a quick little general thing, you want to get a habitat where they have a way to keep away from each other. So most of them will come with like two tubes that they can climb up into. At work, we used a whole bunch of egg crate, and so so basically they need to be separate from each other because if you've ever gotten crickets in a plastic bag and you didn't ask for cardboard, if you ever really watch them, they'll all kind of slide down to the corner and then crawl over each other in order to get out from the corner. And when they're doing that, they're not being gentle to the other ones. So you'll actually have them killing each other, trying to get over each other. They're just not the nicest to their neighbors as far as other animals are concerned. So you need to keep them separate as much as you can. So you probably need more space than you thought you did for if you're keeping crickets, and then keeping them alive even then is still kind of a mess. I mean, you're gonna lose a bunch anyway, no matter what. Whatever you do, you're gonna lose some. So just resign yourself to that fact. And when they do die, they do stink. A lot of people will just not bother doing cricket keeping just based on the smell alone. But they need food and they need water, but they can't just do regular water. They need to have this gel blobs of water so that they don't drown trying to drink from it. Now there's the sandy looking stuff that's their food. There's the globular things that are their water, or you have some orange cubes that are both. It's supposed to be the food and water. And what you can also do in a pinch, or as a supplement, is potato. You can half a potato, quarter of potato, basically put it in there with them, and that acts as food and water as well. That's actually what they get shipped into when they come to the store. They get shipped in a box full of egg crate with some potatoes thrown in, and so they'll eat that thing right down to the skin, and that works as both food and water. So if you want to keep them alive, good luck. Give it a shot. But yeah, honestly, most people just resign themselves to picking a store that's halfway between them and work and just stopping there every once in a while to get them. So, we usually feed at least at the store, the crickets and mealworms on a daily basis. One thing that's good about leopard geckos, bearded dragons do store fat to an extent. They keep it most in their belly. Leopard geckos keep it in their tail, and they can live off that tail for quite a long time. Now the thing is that I am not recommending that you just let a leopard gecko only eat like once a month. I'm not saying that at all. That's cruel and unusual. They would eat more than that in the wild. So honestly, if you could do in the wild, then you honestly shouldn't be a pet parent. There, I said it. So so for that reason, though, leopard geckos are a little bit less of a hassle to leave for vacation. I still always recommend having somebody take them in while you're gone on vacation, just for who knows what might go down. I mean, not to get super crazy, but it's just like, what if there's a house fire? I mean, something like that. So it's always nice to have a babysitter for any animal that you own. But if you're just going out for a few days and you have the lights or whatever you have on an automatic timer for the leopard gecko, more so than the bearded dragon, you could probably get away with it. But again, don't say that, hey, Nick said that I could. No, I'm not advocating ever leaving a pet unattended for any amount of time. But that's one reason why the leopard geckos especially make for a good beginner pet. Because, if the kid, if you're just like, hey, when did the, lizard last eat? And the kid's like, oh, I forgot, well, more likely than not, if they forgot, one of the feedings, the leopard gecko is not going to die from starvation. Same thing with the bearded dragons. They often do have nice wide bellies. And so if you see that starting to shrink, it's going to take a bit before they get to starvation mode. So that's cool too. But more so the leopard geckos. But anyway, that's going to be a nice little lead into handling them because no matter which lizard that you have, you're going to definitely, want to handle them. I mean, isn't that the whole point of getting the pet? So with leopard geckos more so than bearded dragons, at first they're going to think that you're a predator trying to eat them. I mean, from their perspective, can you blame them? I mean, they only fit in your hand. I mean, that's what they think is going to happen. So, when you first handle lizards for the first time, and by the way, don't try and handle them on day one. I say this for any animal. Give them a chance to get used to the new environment before you just start playing with them. I know that it's like getting a video game. You just want to take it home and just put it right into the player, but you definitely want to give them a chance to adjust, as best as you can. I know it's hard to tell your kid that, but, man up and parent, But anyway, so, when you first handle them, I recommend either just going right down on the floor and or standing over a bed. And then that way, if they do happen to try and escape from you, they're going to either land from not so much of a distance or they're going to land on something soft. Because what's really important is with almost any lizard, you don't want to try to catch them by the tail because most lizards have the defense mechanism of dropping their tail and then the tail will wiggle on the ground. That distracts the predator and then the lizard can get away to live another day. Now, especially with leopard geckos, this is problematic because a leopard gecko stores their fat in their tail. That's why their tails are so fat in the first place. So they no longer have a fat storage container if they drop their tail because you grabbed onto it when they tried to escape you. So safe handling first and foremost when you begin. Now, leopard geckos definitely can get adjusted and used to getting handled. Bearded dragons, on the other hand, and this is just a point in their favor. As you've started to learn, bearded dragons are a little bit more problematic when it comes to the habitat, when it comes to the lighting. I mean, they have a little bit more extra caveats. And I didn't even talk about the fact that they need a salad every day. So bearded dragons, so leopard geckos are just carnivorous. Bearded dragons are omnivorous, like us. So when they're young, they're going to mostly eat the protein because they need to grow. Excuse me. I'm leaving it in. I'm not going to edit that out. So I would recommend small salads when they're young because they're not going to eat much of it, but you should always have that ready and supplied for them. And when I say salads, so again, you should research exactly which veggies we're talking about, but just off the top of my head, I know they like kale, dandelion greens, what is it, summer squash, broccoli, so stuff like that. There's a list of stuff they can and cannot eat, and you should definitely, give them some variety. I actually had don't research this before I say it, but I had a customer notice that we always did kale as the base of their food, and she goes, I wouldn't do that, and I said, well, why not? And she goes, well, because he would never eat his salad until I switched the kale to parsley, and now he just eats the entire thing every day. So there you go. Play around with it, see what they like more of, and give them some variety. I know that you appreciate variety. That's one thing that I like about having them is that if they, if the veggies that you get them are starting to get a little bit older and they're about to start wilting, well, you don't want to waste food, so you eat it. Now that was an extra salad that you weren't planning on having. Boom, you're eating healthier because of the pet. That's probably one of the many reasons why you live longer when you have a pet. Not only does it reduce stress and give you a couple extra years because your blood pressure's lower, but sometimes it makes you eat healthier just because you have that in the house for them. But I digress. So I was talking about with the handling. The leopard gecko will learn to absolutely tolerate your presence. A bearded dragon is the dog of the lizard kingdom. They actually enjoy your company. They are social. They like you. They genuinely enjoy you. So, home, I just want to briefly share a fun little experience I had at my former work, where the woman called and so she goes, "This is going to be a really weird question, but can bearded dragons get depressed?" And alrighty, I'm a veteran at this, so I'm like, all right. So here's what's happening. You need to change out your UVB bulb. Now I know that it's still turning on. She interrupts me and she goes, no. My daughter told me that she switched out the UVB bulb just before she left. And I was like, okay. I think I need some more information in order to determine what's going on here. So this isn't your lizard, this is your daughter's lizard. She was like, yes. And then I was like, okay, so she left you very careful instructions about turning the lights on and off, how much they need to eat. And she goes, yes. All right. And, so you've been sticking to that. So you're saying that you notice that he's acting, like lethargic and not the active self that he usually is. She goes, correct. I was like, all right, so answer me this. Did your daughter often, do a lot of handling? Like, did she, like take him out all the time? She was like, oh, they were inseparable. Like she would hang him on the shoulder when she was doing dishes. Like his favorite spot was to be just hanging right here. And so I couldn't see that over the phone, but I knew exactly what she was talking about. You get what I'm saying. I mean, I'm paraphrasing here. So I was like, okay, all right. So so the bearded dragon, his mom would handle him a lot of the times, and she's been gone on vacation. Okay, now since she's been gone, I mean, have you been doing any handling? She goes, I ain't going near that thing, and I was like, well, there you go. I mean, the thing misses there. They actually are a social creature. That bearded dragon had all the heating, lighting, food that it needed, and it was still acting depressed because it missed mommy. Not the mom, but the daughter was its mom. If you get what I'm saying. So yeah, bearded dragons are the dogs of the lizard kingdom. I mean, to the point where I've actually seen them, if it's the right temperature outside, I've seen them come in on a leash. Most of the time, customers bring them in, hanging on their shoulder. Even sometimes when it's cooler, they'll actually open the jacket up, put them there, close the jacket, and then the thing is completely content just getting the body heat warmth. But I've actually seen some come in on a leash when the temperature is appropriate. They really are the dogs of the lizard world. The downside is they don't live as long. So I do want to get into that a little bit because you want to be thinking long term when it comes to owning any pet. But especially with leopard geckos, they can live up to 22 years. So if you're getting them for your little kid that you can never picture coming higher than your waist, that kid's going to pass your waist. That kid is going to get old enough to now go to college, and who knows then? Is the kid's? I mean, if the kid still somehow enjoys having that as a pet, is the kid going to be able to even take it into the dorm? I mean, this might become your lizard. First of all, within a week, because I see this happen all the time. The kid usually loses interest in the new animal once they realize they have responsibilities. After the first tank cleaning, they usually realize, oh, this isn't quite what I thought it was going to be on paper. So oftentimes I see pet parents return it within the 30-day policy, or it just becomes then their pet because they feel too guilty to do the return. But you're not thinking long term. I mean, this thing's going to live until your kid is now a full-fledged adult, out of the house adult. So I mean, are you planning on having that be something that is always in the back of your head, much like, when you had a kid? This is another kid. I know that real parents hate when pet parents refer to themselves as pet parents, but, in a way, I mean, this is 22 plus possibly commitment. And it is a shame that much like dogs, not living, quite as long as us, bearded dragons, I think have a similar lifespan to say a large breed dog. They're definitely a senior when they're 7. I think 5 to 7 years is actually the average, but I've heard people have them last longer than that. But yeah. I mean, again, I want to make sure you get the full gamut of what you have to expect. When you're getting these guys. So they do make for fun pets. The leopard geckos come in the craziest variety of colors. Bearded dragons also. Once you get the eye for it, I mean, they actually do have a really cool look to them. The more orange they are, usually the more expensive they are. They're considered premium because that's often coveted, is having the orange coloring to them. And don't judge a book by its cover, by the way, when it comes to the bearded dragons. If you look at them, it looks like it would hurt to hold them. But that is not the case at all. Much like any reptile, you want to pet them front to back because most of the time they have, so for instance with a bearded dragon, most of their what looks like horns or whatever are pointed that way. So if you brush them backwards, it doesn't feel as good. But they're surprisingly bendable and pliable. And by the way, if you were curious, the bearded part comes from. Hopefully, you never have to see it yourself. But the bearded part comes from the fact that this area on their neck around here, if they ever do get stressed, it turns black, and it almost looks like they now have a beard. And it's something that I hope that you never see. I hope that you never get that bearded dragon stressed out enough that it needs to turn black. But if it happens, it happens. That's life. But that's just where the name comes from. I just thought that was interesting because I had not seen a stressed out bearded dragon for the first handful of years that I worked at the pet store. I guess yay me, or yay the store, that that was the case. But yeah, it took me a long time to figure out why they were even called that. I thought that maybe some of the spikes closer towards the base of their head. Maybe it looked like a beard. I mean, it was a stretch, so I was like, what is that coming from? Leopard gecko, I'm assuming it's because most of the varieties do have spots on them, much like a leopard. I mean, again, it's a stretch because other than that, the coloring looks nothing like a leopard, but that's probably where that comes from too. Again, they make cool companions. They are fun and easy to handle. They're fun to watch, in my opinion. And as far as the upkeep goes, I mean, I'll probably have to do an episode on iguanas, basically try to talk you out of it because they basically need an entire room by the time they get to be an adult. Whereas these guys, you can usually just keep a appropriately sized tank for them. So I'm sure I've missed out on a lot of stuff. So like I said, do your research. I might even put out a point two episode. I do plan on having guests at one point, so I can think of a couple off the top of my head that could definitely go way more into detail when it comes to reptiles. But definitely enjoy your research. And if I haven't scared you off yet, enjoy your new forever friend.